Before you get stuck into today's wonderful episode on Interception, I want to make sure that you all know Tracy's spirit model training is now widely available to those who are interested. If you are listening to this podcast and enjoy these kinds of discussions, then I can 1000% recommend the spirit model training that Tracy and her team at DFX have so diligently put together so that people all around the world who have been asking for them to do training on this can access it. So if you want to deepen your practice and improve your ability just to think holistically about treatment and how to best come at these complex dynamic situations that we find ourselves in treatment, then hit the link in the description and check it out because it will be so worthwhile. The other small side note is that a little while ago, Seed was asked by a local preschool to put together an online course on the basics of regulation, how it unfolds typically in development, how to integrate some of this new theory around polyvagal states, and how we think about that as occupational therapists, along with some practical strategies to support it either at home or in an educational setting. So I wanted to let people know that that course is available. And so if that's useful to one person listening on this podcast, then it will have been worth my time mentioning it. So if you have a parent or you're working with somebody that you just think might benefit from taking just a basic course on regulation, even just newer therapists, if you're interested, then reach out and get in touch and we can point you in the right direction. But I will hold you up no longer. Enjoy. We are wondering today about interoceptive processing and how it relates to, well, for me, how it relates to polyvagal theory, because we've kind of been talking about that in terms of making sense of our arousal and then also whether we're safe or not, and then linking that to the states in our nervous system and then also understanding the different processing in those different states. And we were curious about interoception in the mix of these things because we talked about it a little bit in the episode where we talked about somatosensory processing and it being part of that processing. And we wanted to know a little bit about, or if we could flesh out, I guess, how interoception changes as we move through the different states. So if we're in a ventral vagal state or we're in the social engagement system and we're regulated and interoceptive processing is still weak, like what kind of clinically should we be thinking about and what could we do around that? And then if we start to get stressed and we move into a sympathetic state, what I guess just inherently is disrupted in interoceptive processing in a more sympathetically activated state. And I know it's not as simple as just like pure sympathetic activation or pure ventral vagal or any of that, but we'll try to keep it as simple as possible just to talk about it, but maybe not because we like to go there in this conversation. And then also maybe if we hit more of a dorsal vagal shutdown kind of immobilization states, what is potentially happening in the interoceptive processing in that space, and what we can look out for clinically, and then also maybe what we can do to adjust our treatment depending on where kids are at. So what do you guys think?
Yeah. Good. It's a great sense of questions. Yeah. Next 3 episodes, right on, Michelle. Oh man. Yeah. So I think it's really cool to think about each of these systems in such detail. The thing that's interesting for me is that, it pulls into my mind because I've just studied the brain a lot and I think about it in a kind of, I don't think it's idiosyncratic the way that my brain works. I'm kissing my brain, but I think that it's a little bit of, I've disciplined myself to think about the pathways, to think about the tracks, to think about the receptors, to think about the where information goes and for the purpose of what, right? That's always my guiding question. And so, I think what happens so often in our thinking about these sensory integrative processes is that it's easy to either be too general or too too detailed. So in the podcast form, because we don't have visuals, we can kind of post a couple articles or whatever in the show notes, certainly. But because I'm picturing in my own mind's eye the receptors, or I'm picturing the pathways, or I'm thinking about the insula. And, we don't often say in a normal conversation to each other, like, I'm thinking about the insula. Maybe we should.
Anterior or posterior, actually, Trace.
That's right. So it brings up all those questions about where does interoception, what is it, how is it processed? And then it is connected to our state. And we can think about state really in a rich and beautiful way through the polyvagal theory. So I love thinking about it there. So that just gives us like a lot to talk about. And none of that is directly clinical. So of course, as I meander through some of these more of the what is the receptor doing, then let's be sure that you guys help me to land it back in clinical cases, because I think this podcast is so beautiful that way, the way we dialogue about the clinical implications and kind of how do we bring it to life for us as occupational therapists. And so anyway, I just wanted to do that.
Good.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Were you going to talk about the receptors and the interoceptive system today?
Yeah,
Trace?
so I think we should touch base on it, partly because it's an interesting thing when we say state of the nervous system. So let's say that we're in a regulated ventral state. The receptors actually function differently than they do when we're in a dysregulated state. And so we think about state sometimes as like happening in the autonomic or central nervous systems, but it affects the receptor. And so it's true that we have to think about the receptors. And if you think about your interoceptors, they're the deep somatosensory receptors that are in your body, but we have interoceptors in our eyes and in our ears, and throughout our oral, facial structures, throughout our pharynx and larynx and our esophagus, and in our lungs and in our heart and in our guts and in our vascular system, in our pressure throughout our connective tissue. It's really, they're everywhere, interoceptors. So sometimes I think we should start there by just saying that for us as occupational therapists, when we hear interoception, we really need to make sure we're always broadening beyond the visceral organs, which is what so many people think of when they think about interoceptors. And in that, we're going to tie together vestibular proprioceptors, tactile receptors, all into this category of interoception. So we're crossing categories all the time, and we have to have the fluidity of thinking. It's not a rigid set of labels. And so does that feel comfortable to think about interoception that way?
Yeah, in my mind, I've kind of looped it into the somatosensory processing piece, but then also I'm always thinking about the vestibular piece in amongst that, because they all form that body concept. I mean, everything does, but like they're the real receptors of the body of ourselves, I guess. So I kind of try to think about them, parcel them out when I can, and put them back together as often as I can as well.
Yeah. Oh, I do too, and probably think about tissues, like I guess fascia is part of that as well. So I don't kind of just think about it in terms of organs. Can I complicate things this early and wonder about emotions? Like how, because my understanding is your feelings and emotions and a sense of that in the body is part of interoception as well, and not just the tissue within the body.
How do you normally explain that to parents, Michelle?
I talk about it as having two aspects. Again, this is as in a way to
put you on the spot.
No, but it's just, I just want to say that I'm going to do it really simple. But I just really say that it's the internal expression in the body that is being noticed in the brain, or may not be noticed in the brain. And that includes the tissues, the organs. So I usually break that down, heart rate, blood pressure, thirst, bladder, bowels is a really easy one talk about. But so it's those organs, but it's also the feelings within the body. And I guess I tease that apart because some of the kids we work with or people we work with, it can be easily noticed that they don't perceive that they're hot, like their temperature regulation mightn't be noticed by the child, or bladder and bowel, so they might have some continence issues. But I see that there's also this emotional dysregulation that's part of it. They're not noticing that they're getting a bit frustrated or nervous. And so that's kind of in noticing the internal landscape for them and knowing what to do about it is just as complicated and nuanced for the feelings as it is for the body system. So it's just really a story about saying what's happening on the inside. Trace, am I right though? I didn't get the nod. Is feelings and emotions part of interoception?
100%. Yeah. So sometimes you'll hear different OTs or often folks who are thinking a lot about emotion regulation or affective regulation, they'll start to get to the level of understanding that affect is the evaluation or the coding of the experience is sort of pre-emotion, and that sensation and affect are dually coding for each other. And it's really actually through the interoceptive functions that carry that information to the amygdala and then into the insula, actually. Where that dual coding is actually happening. But it's interesting in that there is actual coding in the periphery too. That is both sensation and affective, or more affective valence than just pure affect.
So you mean like negative or positive in the periphery?
Yeah.
I'm going to an extreme example, but like if I touch something that's kind of sharp, then it's like right then and there negatively coded in the receptor right at my fingertip. And I know that's a really obvious example, but is that what you're meaning?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's also like the context for sensation matters so much. So sharp is sharp. So sharp is a threat, right? But let's think about something like social touch, okay? And then social touch on different parts of your body. So my daughter recently moved back to Colorado after living in New York City for 10 years. And so she kind of went from being a teenager, because she moved there when she was beginning university. And so she was in her late teens still when she moved there. Let's have a hiatus and talk about my interoception of letting my daughter move to New York City when she was 18. That's a separate story. But, so she spent formative early adult years and then is now a full grown adulting person, right? But this comes back to social touch in that in our family, we are quite tactile with each other. We're super cuddly. We like to spend that kind of time together. And one of the things she was laughing about was that it's quite common for her to come in if I'm sitting in our family room and she sits on the couch next to me. She would sit down over there, maybe, because it's like an L-shaped couch. You can see my L if we're on the video. But and so she might sit there so we can have an easy conversation. But at some point she's going to migrate closer and closer because she's going to want a shoulder rub or like a tactile kind of connected moment.
Yeah.
And then we were laughing about it because she's quite aware that she doesn't really like people to touch her neck unless it's in that context. And so we were actually talking about interoception the other day because she said, why is that? Like, why is it that if my neck is so off limits, unless it's in this context where then it's like I can't get enough? And so that's all based on this evaluative system and the coding that's happening in the affective system, in the attachment, but in the connection and in the relationship system, and how that sets a different scene and tone for how the receptors actually are functioning. And so what's interesting about that is that if you are not open to receive, the receptors themselves become more bristly. They're like, nah, they're more rejecting and more likely to receive the information in a defensive way, in a protective way, not just over response, but defensive protection, right? versus when we feel the warmth of the interoceptive experience, and that opens and creates a spaciousness in the receptors themselves to be open to being touched. And so there's this powerful thing happening there, right? Isn't that cool?
Yeah, it's super cool. I kind of talk about this as like, it's not my example, but I've read it out in multiple places, but the last place I saw it was, I think it was in Affective Neuroscience by Jacques Panksepp. And he was talking about context for processing of affect and that situation of the dark car park at night. It's the most clear, obvious example people can resonate with, because we all feel a little more on edge when you're alone and you're walking to your car and it's dark and it's, and your whole nervous system is shifted into a more protective, defensive state so that you can respond if you need to, because the context of that environment drives our processing. And I think that's, it just makes so much sense. It helps integrate this information around sensory processing and state and this dynamic that we have around it. But I don't think I'd ever really fully included the receptors. So I think you're right in my thinking. I probably was thinking more about state centrally, and not really, like you'd see it in the body, but I've never really thought it even changes down to the level of the receptor, the way that it's going to just valencely, like that's not a word, but positively or negatively receive the input, I guess. And it shifts that valence in a certain direction. And that makes a lot of sense to me.
And it sets the tone, doesn't it, really? And it's interesting in both those examples that should your daughter be touched on the neck or feel like she's been touched on the neck in the dark alleyway, that, is very, very different to her being with you and being really comfortable, but having some personal space and then looking at you in a way that's conducive to a, conversation. And she's approaching you, her body then is like, okay, I need some more, proximity, touch, whatever. But she's even opened up to you in the family room that's a known space. But I guess she's coming back and there's some newness to that. But it's like even then there's, I don't know, with some people you come right in.
I love that, Michelle, the approach part of it, because it comes back to that control. Like, and we're talking about in treatment, one of the big things for safety is giving control back. And I think obviously for your daughter, Tracy, her being in control of the approach around the input. And of course, like your mom, like you're a whole different person in terms of safety and all that you represent for her. But yeah, she in the approach, right? Like that changes the nervous system in itself.
There's a drive for it. There's a request for it then. So then she's like, and obviously that's what she's reflecting. I was like, hey, how come I want for you to touch my neck and I'm coming for you to touch my neck, but it doesn't work like that for other people in other times. So fascinating that she can even talk that through, and that we as OTs that talk about all the things that we do, and it's such a personal growth experience in our clinic, because we're observing each other do life, really.
Yeah, totally.
It's just interesting where our little kids with, or people with not the language and not the knowing, it's like, no wonder it's really awkward. I think I told you about another little boy, but I saw him yesterday. He runs at me like he's going to tackle me around the legs and give me the gorgeous hug. Yet last time I explained that he did it around my face, his hands around my face, and just literally like, oh. Yesterday he ran to me and pulled up short and I kind of bobbed down, crouched down to be with him. He stopped about a foot from me, and we just literally just were like, oh, I'm so excited. But there was such a mobilized approach and energy that he doesn't need the tactile component of it to be expressing and probably receiving warmth or joy or approach from me. It was just the running and the stopping. Anyway, we're digressing a little from Interception, but I don't know that it is, because I think he knows, I don't need to touch you, Michelle, to get that juice from seeing you. It's really hard not to it's so natural for me to have them come up and literally encircle my legs or whatever. He doesn't. And because I do love touch, it's hard. I have to think about it to not touch him and really kind of follow his lead, to be like, where are you going? How far are your hands going to come up to my little face but not touch me?
So cute.
Yeah, and just attune to that, really.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So, our biases, our internal motivations around what feels right to us is informed by our interoceptive processing across all the different interoceptors, whether they're visceral or tactile, proprioceptive, external receptors, or vestibular, kind of the vibration receptors, the ones that pick up on the zhuzh of what's going on around us. All of those things tell us and reinforce to us our tendencies and proclivities. But as we kind of tune into them, even for little ones, they'll tune into that and use it as a go signal. Yes, go ahead and hug me, or a stop signal. No, maybe not so much. And right away, even in very little children, we pick up on these cues from each other around the social boundaries, social space, what feels comfortable, what doesn't feel comfortable. And it's all based in this neuroceptive function of comfort and safety versus the opposite of that, which feels threatening or uncomfortable, disruptive, or something I need to protect myself from. So that valence-based function that neuroception is picking up is really driven by interoceptors in very many ways. Of course, it's through all of the sensory systems, but they're going to be processed through this low route and then eventually into the insula. And so that's where we pick up that cueing. And it does inform us. For me, I'm kind of a hugger, but I'm going to pick up on cues pretty fast if somebody's not a hugger. And I might interact with folks who are not huggers, and you either learn that about them and there's no qualitative judgment about is the hugger or the non-hugger the way to be. It's like what works for you. There's a colleague of mine here in Denver who started a new podcast recently, actually, that's kind of about this. It's not about interoception. It's about the social experience and all of our neurodiversity. But I love the name of their podcast. It's called You Don't Want to Hug, right? Because her starting space is no thank you very much, and my starting space is sort of thank you very much. So both are awesome.
Bring it in.
And I think that's sort of sweet.
Cool.
Thought it would be worth mentioning that.
I'd have to check it out.
This is where the social piece and the cognitive piece and that tuning in, because if you're really focused internally, because you might be tactile defensive, that you really have a strong sensation of fluctuations in temperature or, bowel, you may be so focused internally that you don't even tune in to you're not a hugger. And so I come on in because I am, and my focus is on my internal story, or the opposite, that I'm so focused on the story externally that I don't notice what's happening for myself internally, and I get really tired and thirsty and whatever. But I can see how things can go wrong really quickly if you're not able to shift the attentional system from internal to external scapes or whatever your environments really fast, and then know that either pick it up very quickly from neuroception, but also from your social knowing of other people's perspective. Like there's so much social skill or capacity required to make those nuances, because if you just do a little sidestep, Trace, to avoid a cuddle coming in, somebody has to notice that and go, that angling back might mean she's like, well, we'll step back as like that's a definite no hug, versus my need for a hug is so great that I'm not even going to I'm not tuning into what your needs are. I'm just fulfilling my own at the moment. Yeah. So if there's any kind of neurodiversity around our interoception functions and or social and or executive functioning, I can see how it just can go wrong.
Yeah. My brain goes many directions, but what you were talking about, Michelle, made me think about the relationship that we have with a caregiver early on that can help us tune in to the experience and code that experience for us. And that without that, we might be a little wayward in our ability to make sense of those internal signals and, you know, not just interoception, but the whole body, like, and people helping us code that experience. But before someone helps me label and understand and make sense a bit more cognitively of the interoceptive processing, Tracy, I was wondering earlier, we were talking about emotions or feelings, and these words get confusing, but I'm curious about the pickup of that in the body. I guess it depends on the receptor. So first of all, I'm kind of wondering, do we actually know what the receptors look like in interoceptive processing? Because that, I don't know, I'm weird. It helps me to know actually what the receptor physically looks like sometimes. I know that's really detailed, but the reason I like to know that is because I want to know how it gets activated, and then that helps me understand what the process is. So do we know that well enough of, like, what's the receptor, how does it pick up, and what is actually is it a physical change, is it a chemical change? Like, how can we talk about that, or am I leading us wayward here?
Yeah, well, I want to try to answer it. I think it's such a good thing to try to grapple with. So the receptors, most interoceptive receptors are somatosensory receptors,
Okay.
but they change depending on the state. So that's the thing that can get a little bit complicated to try to trace out and track out.
Okay.
And that feels to me like a little bit tricky to do here. But if we, like, let's just stick with any particular receptor. Let's say that we're thinking about the stretch receptors in our viscera or around our heart or lungs, in our ears or in our mouths or in our throats. So the tension, the relative tension, that's a stretch receptor. Those are proprioceptors, and they are interoceptors. If you are in a state of like blissful excitement and you are ready to have a dialogue with a friend, so that would be describing us right now. We have a certain degree of tension that is being produced through the vagal circuitry, through the interoceptors, to bring our voices into a bit more connected melodic quality, because we're feeling warm and engaged with each other. And we're really working to be connected across space and time and to share this moment that we love doing together. So the stretch receptors are constraining. So the sensory processing tends to direct and constrain and enhance processing through that process, right? So the receptors themselves are changed based on the state, and the number of receptors and the quality of receptors are also changed based on that state. So if instead, I was in a dorsal shutdown kind of state, the quality of my ability to even access my voice might be shut down. So I might become selectively mute, and I might not even be able to mobilize the sensory motor function of my vocal system because I'm in so much shutdown. And that's a change in the receptors themselves. So they change constantly. The initial change, the valence-based change, is actually electrical. And that's the first thing that changes in the sequential processing. Then it becomes chemical, and it becomes complicated chemical soup, right? So that is
It
a
always is.
story of up and down regulation, inhibition, disinhibition, facilitation. All of those things are happening within the chemical system.
Okay.
But it initially is based on this neuroceptive signaling of a sensory affective quality that tells us, is this a good thing? Do I want more of it? Do I want less of it? And those are all interoceptive signals that come from the receptors.
Okay. Can I see if I can wrap my head around it? So if at the moment, just in this conversation, we're in more of a ventral vagal space, we feel more open and more connected, so we can have this fun conversation. And in that space, and maybe it's chicken or egg, but at the moment we'll start with we're in that space. And in that comes the signaling from, like, whenever I smile, I get the receptors in my face and I have more access to that function. I guess I get more signal, and I guess they feed back, I'm in this state and now I'm doing these things, and the proprioceptors are telling me that this is a joyful experience, and I'm getting the continued sustained interaction between the information in my body and then the state, and that I'm checking in with that all the time. I guess that they're at a match, I'm assuming. So if a signal came in and I didn't feel good, or I was like, I'm unsure, or I'm thinking really hard, or whatever, then maybe I have less access to my open engagement. It kind of gets shut off a little bit, and then the body kind of does the same thing in terms of the proprioceptors change in the way that I'm using them and then in the way that I can access them.
That's right.
Even just for functions around talking. Okay. And I guess, it can drive the other direction, I guess, can't it? Like, they can drive each other in this direction of the receptor can drive the shift in the state, and the state can drive the shift in the receptor. And it's, again, chicken or egg. But I guess we have to look at the dynamic, don't we?
Right. And because we're in a trusting, safe relationship with each other, and we don't tend to give each other very many signals of uncertainty, then we can stay in a pretty continuous flow with each other. We've all experienced lots and lots and lots of social interactions pretty much on a daily basis, where the safety isn't 1,000% established and the trust and connection isn't 1,000% solid. And you say something to somebody and you get that little pause where you're literally having a mismatch. We're like, did that land for that person? And we even may say that out loud. Once we're aware, we certainly, our nervous system is asking that question right away before we ever say it. So this kind of gets into the deeper part of interoceptive processing and the posterior and anterior parts of the insula, and how those kind of connect back to the deeper circuitry that's lower than the insula, and the circuitry that surrounds the insula that allows for social and higher level executive and cognitive and language skills to kind of help us with the storying of what's happening in the anterior parts of the insula. So the higher parts of the insula, we think about as interoceptive awareness. So we have an awareness. But the lower centers, there isn't a conscious awareness of it. It's the part where you get the signal, where something doesn't feel comfortable, or where something feels like it's shifting. So when neuroception signals to us that there's a slight constraining or shifting off of pure safety, we start to have this little bit of a different experience. And a lot of that is going to get processed, pretty broadly through the brainstem, in autonomic functions in the limbic system, but certainly in the posterior parts of the insula. And what happens is there's a mismatch then between what's expected and what's happening. And it's the mismatch that actually signals us, oh, I'm having an emotion. I'm having uncertainty. I'm having a trigger of wonder. I'm having a trigger of pause, of I was in full approach, but maybe now I need to pause and I'm sort of oops. So as soon as we have that happen, that sort of shifts us into this more awareness-based process. And that is a much more cognitively mediated process than the lower parts, which are not at all based in awareness. Is that clear?
Yeah, I think so.
That's super helpful.
Yeah, so you have an initial neuroception around safety or not, so that valence of like, is this positive or is it negative, and it's coming in through all of the sensory receptors, and they're, depending on the state, they're receiving that in certain ways. But if that information comes in and goes up into the brain, is taken up into the brain, goes through the brainstem, obviously the amygdala, some of the, like you talk about, low route processing, so the lower components in the brain there, that sends it up in through to the insula, which is sort of more central it's kind of low but central. Would you say?
Yeah, it's a pretty big structure, and it really does go from, more frontally oriented parts of it that are anterior, but the posterior parts of the insula are really technically in the lower limbic system. They're subconscious, and they're really interacting more with autonomic and brainstem functions.
Right, so that it hits that spot, and if it hits that spot and we are in a certain, well, you said use approach. So like if we're in a place where things are feeling like, let's just imagine we're 100% safe. Maybe that never happens, but like imagine you're in 100% of safety, and then suddenly you get a neuroceptive signal that maybe you need to not be in an approach right now. You need to change. So initially just subconsciously hits those parts in the brain, and then it's a mismatch to what? Like, what would we call that? If it's the signal is now changed and now we need to shift out of approach, it's a mismatch in the insula, but how?
Yeah, so part of it is that if our awareness is I'm safe, and this feels good to me, we have that pre-perceptual. So most of neuroception is not really, it's below the level of perception.
Yeah.
But then it tips into perception because the processing is continual and it's temporal, and it's, it's happening in a live feed all the time. And so what is not perception becomes perception, and it becomes awareness. So when you first have a sense of safety, then you are safe. So awareness comes.
Okay.
And the mismatch is, we get that intuitive almost feeling. It's this kind of, rapid, there's something that doesn't feel right anymore. The mismatch is really critical because it's a mismatch partly in the insula. So the insula is like the awareness part of the anterior insula processing is telling us this is what's happening to you. And then when it shifts, it's like something shifted. And because this is all based on a valence and we have an expectancy kind of paradigm, if we're in safety and it shifts out, the shift is away from safety. So the mismatch is, I was safe, but now I'm not.
Right. So it pulls oh, sorry, you go.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, so it pulls that pre-perception, not a subconscious processing. This change in signal pulls in the awareness processing to then go, hey, something changed. Maybe we need to change behavior. Like now we pull in cognitive awareness of the experience, and it might be really quickly and rapid. Like obviously, usually it's probably pretty rapid that we do that, but there is a blending of the two, I guess. So I'm just wondering about treatment. Like, what do you think, Michelle?
Well, I'm just thinking of keep using us as an example, Corey. So you and I, which we do sometimes not quite get each other, but because we're bathed in safety mostly, but if I want to say something a bit sharper or blunt or whatever, and there's just what does she mean by that? I'm still mostly bathed in safety. When it moves up to perception of, it's a curiosity of, what did you mean by that? Or, did I get that right? But it's dampened that down so I won't go so mobilized. But I've picked up, there was a curiosity, there was a bump. And then I do that from a social exec functioning, pull in, hey, what happened there? I noticed that. And then we're like, blah, 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 blah. And then we keep going kind of thing. So that's how I'm perceiving it. But if you are not in such a consistently safe environment, that miscuing might more rapidly escalate to a, whoa, something happened. And if it's a big cue or you're not invested in the person, I might just walk away. You know what I mean? If it's in the street and it's like, actually, I'm not exploring that. That was a mismatch. And yeah, no worries, mate. See you later. It's just like, bye, I'm out of there. And you don't check out, did I get that right? Anyway, I was just trying to give a social example of how that cascade might happen, and that if you're in safety, you might dampen that down. But if you're in a context which isn't so cueing of safety, so back in the alley, you're just going to take the nuance of, there's a mismatch, and you might be out of there and have a much stronger or less inhibited reaction to it.
And maybe appropriately so.
Absolutely. And maybe the context is like, you were right to leg it out of that alley. But I wonder if that's what's happening in the clinic, that there's a little something goes, or a big something, a perception of something goes wrong, and we see the kiddo have a bigger reaction to it and pull away. And then we have to try and uncover what bit happened there. Was it a loud sound of my voice? Was it the social stuff? Was it not winning? And you bail. Yeah. That's not purely interception, but maybe it's a sensation of, I've got to do a wee and it's coming really fast, and I don't feel it till it's really ready and I've got a full bladder and I just got to go, and I can't stay here in this interaction anymore.
I agree, Michelle. I just respond to that beautiful comment. But yeah, can we talk a little bit about now then the states? Like, because Michelle's talking here about moving into a flight or that mobilization. I'm thinking about the sympathetic nervous system pulling in and then resourcing us to deal with the potential threat. But I wonder then how that interacts with interoceptive processing. Probably, I guess on both fronts, on the awareness, on our ability to perceptually be aware of our interoceptive processing, and then also on the not awareness, because I assume it impacts both. That subconscious processing of interoception probably gets altered, but then also the conscious awareness, what we will pay attention to in a mobilized state, is going to be different as well. So can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. All of this is so interesting because it does make us move in our thinking and not silo our thinking to, it's an interoceptive problem, so I'm going to treat it interoceptively, or it's a social engagement issue, or it's, whatever happens to be, because these things are interacting with each other across this neural circuitry. Yeah. So the polyvagal system is one part of that. And then interoceptive processing itself is a part of that. And then our social and problem solving, all of these things, right? They're interactive. So that's why we need a tool like the Spirit, honestly, is to sort it so we can try to identify clinically where are the strengths and where's really robust resource available for this kiddo or whoever, this family, us, ourselves, maybe, or like, what are we going to be targeting a bit in interventions? So our state, if we're in a ventral state, like we're here together in a ventral state, we feel safe and we feel connected and we can operate from that. If we get a mismatch in our social interaction, which happens, it's happened in this podcast even a few times, right? Where we kind of miss time or what, and part of that's just the technology, but it's human interaction is funny that way. So when that happens, the mismatch to us, it is a neuroceptive cue. Before we're aware of it, it's a neuroceptive cue, but we're not tipping out of safety. And so the neuroceptive function, it organizes approach avoidance, and it really organizes activation and deactivation based on what is the valence doing itself. And so if we're in safety and we're in engagement, we're going to pretty much stay in that steady state until the interaction or cues change. It could be that the cues from our body change. So if we're in a really robust deep conversation, we can't sustain it forever. And we run out of energy, we run out of air, we can't sustain the oohiness for a long, long time. And so we inevitably get an interoceptive cue that we need to shift something. And that shift, when we stay in ventral, is available to us. We can make lots of choices. The thing about the state dependency is that as soon as you're not in ventral, and you could be in a blended state. So you could be partially in ventral, but you could start to have a mobilization into sympathetic activation for whatever cue would shoot you there. And then you have a little bit less spacious choice available to you in what's on the horizon for you. And as that becomes narrow and more constrained and more pushed by the state, the interoceptive cues follow. And so regulation begets regulation, dysregulation begets dysregulation. It's the kindling process is happening.
And this is what happened, Corey. We had a business meeting yesterday, which we were very invested in. And I needed to go to the toilet by the end of it. So the meeting finished and Corey Zoomed me so we could finish our component of the conversation. And she was like, how are you going? I was like, it's all really awesome, but I need to go to the toilet. And then it was like, okay, blah, 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 blah. And anyway, at the end, I cared less. I was like, yep, no worries. I got to go to the toilet. I'm going to wet my pants. See you later. Like literally, I went from this is got 100%. And I was probably in a blended state. I'd been thinking about it a lot and very excited. So it was ventral and sympathetic. I am less able to tune in. I can hyper focus. And so I think I'll tune into my body less. I'd had back-to-back sessions as well, I got to say. So I hadn't noticed, you got your bladder 30% full, Michelle. Maybe you should, whatever, 50%. So I had this exciting, had no cues probably in the meeting. And then at the end of the meeting, when it was like, that went really well, it was like, you've really got to go to the toilet. And so I knew Corey would ring. So it was like, hey, how you going? Yeah,
I should have let you go. But then again, that's my not queuing in, being like, I just want to talk about this. Oh, fun times.
Which I just did too. So eventually I was like, okay, safety, Corey, juicy content. This is awesome. Suppress the need to go to the toilet. Hang in there. Till Interception was like, you are going to wear your pants if you don't leave. Is that about that attentional system, Tracy? I think about that attention and ability to shift in and out, and certainly in that focus state that that has that sympathetic activation to hold your focus, we're less able, I guess, to tune in to keep us in that state, and we're driven to stay in that state, to have that meeting or this podcast. We tune out a little, like under my conscious awareness. Am I really monitoring my internal landscape as much as I am if I'm just going to go vacuum in the house after the podcast kind of thing? So is that what's happening? Do I do I not shift my attention internally, externally as frequently and automatically when I'm really invested in something? So can the attentional system drive issues with interception?
Oh, absolutely it can. Yeah. So if you have a harder time, using that attention or shifting, it definitely can make it harder. It's a cognitive resource to pay attention to it, but you don't need to pay attention to it until the valence shifts. So you don't need to pay attention to your bladder control once you have bladder control until your bladder starts to get full. And it's the stretch receptors and the full feeling that start to shift the signal to say, wait, pay attention to me because something's happening here that's meaningful. So the meaning of the sensation becomes heightened when it becomes heightened. Until then, you aren't inhibiting it. It just isn't salient enough that the valence hasn't called your attention to it. But attention is a tricky function that is really a big, huge topic that maybe we can entertain in a future episode in a bit more detail. But I think about it like in the anterior insula, okay, as soon as you really have a deep thirst and the valence tips, like this isn't just you're ignoring your body. No, you really are deeply thirsty and you really need it. Then the interoceptive awareness will become a stronger signal. And whatever the rest of your frontal cortex is doing in the attentional system, it's like, hey, buddy, knock it off. Pay attention over here, finally. And so once the anterior insula gets fussy like that, it will draw your attention away from the other things your attention system is so very busy doing all the time. And so the anterior insula it sort of becomes nudgy. And we want it to do so. That's its job, actually.
So that's the individual differences, Tracy, because I see that some kiddos' valence is perhaps set differently. So I had a really articulate little girl I was working with, and she was able to draw out on a scale that her first knowing or perception that she had to go to the toilet is she perceived herself at her bladder was about 8 or 9, like full on a scale of 10. And that if she was in the playground and had a long way to go, she would have to go immediately, but she couldn't run because that put pressure on it. Anyway, it was so fascinating that there was no valence tipping for her, or, you know, the anterior insula wasn't getting nudgy, getting antsy and demanding that attention earlier. And that's why continence issue was such an issue for her. When she got the signal, she was like, oh, I'm off. I got to go do that. And she knew to do that. It just came late for her. Yeah. So can we shift that, Trace? Can we shift to valence at that receptor?
Yeah. So it also brings up the really important dual processing of discrimination as well. So if you really have an urgency, that's a valence tip, and that's going to drive it. But before the urgency becomes critical, so the urgent signal should be closer to like a 4 or 5. And then that should be enough for you to have discriminative awareness of those interoceptors. And awareness can come not just from the valence tip, but just from there's a qualitative difference here that I'm tuning into. And so for a lot of kiddos, that takes a long developmental course. Even in some kids, especially boys, are a little slower with this, and it takes a little longer to develop that awareness for urgency for urination, for instance. So there's kind of a lot of different themes we're talking about here. But for this kiddo, you know, you can improve both. You can improve your reactivity to the valence. So we have a lot of kids that we see for toileting needs where they're averse to toileting because they hate the feeling. And so that's more of a modulation, valence-based kind of intervention that you're doing versus the kiddo that you're trying to build the awareness when it's not urgent, the pre-urgent valence driven, but the earlier sensory discrimination driven. So, you know, Kelly Mahler is an OT who she and her colleagues in Pennsylvania have done all of this incredible work around researching this and developing some interventions and, you know, but they're very interoceptive awareness based interventions. So you work on building actual awareness of tactile discrimination, of knowing whether something is soft or hard or wet or dry or cold or hot or squishy or pushable or whatever. You do all of this sort of sensory discrimination building across the tactile system, across all of our systems, and including across our internal sensory motor ability to squeeze our tummies or take a deep breath or blow hard, or all these different functions that they're really interoceptively based, but they're also in our awareness. So that's an important set of interventions. But a lot of our kids, the issue is pre that. It's more in the posterior insula, and it's in the lower functions. So I think we have to be discerning about, if you're working with this little girl you're talking about only around the valence and urgency, then we're going to miss the part around her sensory discrimination. But if we only work on the sensory discrimination, she may always feel some level of negative valence for going to the toilet because she associates it with urgency. She may associate it with, I never make it on time. And then, it brings up all of these sense of self issues. It can be a lot of interoceptive cues can be deep shame triggers for any of us, even for very little children. And we have to be really aware of that. So yeah, it brings up a lot of issues for our treatment, for sure.
Oh, that's probably where we should go in our next episode. Because I'm amazed we have chewed through time today and I did not even realize.
There you go. Perception of time. Obviously, we didn't get any interoceptive cues to say, hey, pull up, you guys.
Or maybe I just ignored them, so invested. No, that's been such a useful conversation. I don't know if I've ever heard this discussed prior to this conversation. So I'm hoping other people will have some fun thoughts about it as well. And maybe, we can think about what we dive into in the next episode, jumping off of this one.
Yeah, we'll look forward to questions from listeners around this topic or any of the topics, and look forward to going in the treatment direction around this in a little bit more detail. Yeah, great.